I'm going to be talking about biogeography, which already has been mentioned repeatedly. This is one of Wallace's big claims to fame. He's sometimes billed as the father of biogeography, i.e. the study of the distribution of animals and plants. He is without question, however, the father of a rich discipline which is evolutionary biogeography, which, if you like, adds a historical dimension, a time dimension to the just manifest distribution of animals. There is this line that runs through all of Wallace's thought, which is informed by his early life experience as a surveyor. Recall he left school, parlous domestic finances. He leaves school 13, 14, and is apprenticed to his older brother, William, who is a land surveyor. And in particular, developing railways and so on. He's mapping. The other key thing that it gave him as he tramped through the countryside, pulling his chain to make sure there's an exact distance between pole 1 and pole 2, is it exposed him to the natural world, British plants in particular. He could walk, this slightly dorky, over 6 foot tall, bearded, awkward, angular individual, white man with a beard, could walk into a village in way back where, okay? And people would run away from him. He has some lovely anecdotes about his problem. Nobody will stay still because they all stare at him, scream, and run away. So that's the first problem. But then there's this empathy thing, that somehow he could build up a real bond of trust and be accepted, be part of the community, and in return, people would help him. So this wasn't an entirely solo exercise pursuing specimens. This started, by the way, in the rural pubs of England, a great place to develop empathy, I have to say. In his autobiography, he has a number of lovely anecdotes about meeting, for want of a better term, the local yokels. So he's moving from village to village every night, staying in a different place, hanging out with a bunch of hayseeds. A number of components of the mature Wallace, which are clearly being developed in these early surveying days. So he goes off to Brazil, remember his first great expedition, 4 years. He's a surveyor. He's passionately interested in beetles, but his real expertise is in surveying. This is actually interestingly analogous to Darwin. We think of Darwin as going off on the voyage of the beagle. He's interested in finches, of course, right? That's what he's interested in. No, Darwin is a geologist. That's what he's interested in. He went to the Galapagos excited to see a volcano erupting. Okay, so it happened there weren't any volcanoes erupting, damn, and there were a few interesting organisms. He was lucky, okay? Wallace is primarily a geographer / surveyor, and in a sense, secondarily, a biologist. Which is why, by the way, one of his great achievements, and one which is overlooked, is the map he made in Brazil. Well, not just in Brazil, in the upper reaches of the Rio Negro. So he's split off with Bates. Bates has gone on the Solomoes. He's going up the Rio Negro. He's basically by himself. What he's going to do is carry out a really detailed mapping survey of everything that he sees. So he's doing everything. He's not dying of yellow fever. He's mourning the loss of his brother. And the result was published by the Royal Geographical Society in London. And it's this map. The Rio Negro from observations made in the years 51 and 52 by Alfred R. Russel. So Alfred Russel Wallace. And this is the entire river system, and this is just the upper reaches. And I'd have to zoom right in. You get all sorts of beautiful detail. Each river turn is, in a sense, annotated. This, it turns out, remember the crude tools he's got at his disposal, turns out to be a fantastic map. This remained the industry standard for this part of the Amazon River system for, I'm going to say, about a century to come. It's really an extraordinary achievement. Wallace the Surveyor. And just as a mark of that achievement, by the way, remember he's returned penniless, broke, failed, burned out, you might say, not intending to be ironic, from the Brazil voyage. He does, however, have one well-placed sponsor. This is Roderick Murchison, the boss, the president of the Royal Geographical Society, who is so impressed by the work that Wallace has done and the fact that he's managed to salvage that beautiful map from the disaster. He managed to get a government sponsorship, essentially, for Wallace. So he actually got rather nice, actually, first-class fare on a P&O steamer to Singapore. Wallace couldn't afford to do his next expedition without this kind of sponsorship. He's collecting. And this is a paper he published again in that, essentially in that brief window that he's back in the UK between expeditions. And it's a gripe. There's this previous naturalist called Mr. Spix who just refers blithely to the fact that you've got a certain species of monkey which is on the banks of the Amazon. That's hopeless, Mr. Spix. Why? Because everyone knows, certainly the natives and me, know that in fact there's much more refined information out there. Namely, the fact that the monkeys are on one side and not on the other. In other words, the river is a very significant barrier to dispersal of this species. Now, as Jim Costa described this morning, that idea of isolation is absolutely key to evolutionary thinking. The thing about being isolated is there ain't no gene flow. There's no genetic exchange. So the two isolated populations will inevitably get more different from each other. If they're not isolated and they're exchanging genes, they're not going to get more different from each other. So right from the get-go, from this early expedition, Wallace is attuned to what's there and to the nuances of geography. And I'm going to add to something that David Quammen said this morning. I think it's absolutely right. One of the really interesting things about being a commercial collector is you want to get tons of the bloody things. There's a cock of a rock. I'm going to get lots and lots and lots of them, right? Why? Because I can sell them. Okay, so he's going to take a bunch for himself, for his own collection, and then he's going to take a whole bunch that he can sell. Okay, but there's another factor about commercial work like this. Here I'm at point 0. Here's a beetle. Okay, I'm now going to travel 50 kilometers upstream, and here's another beetle. Now it's kind of similar, but it's also kind of different. Now, so question is that a different species? Is it a subspecies? Ultimately, it comes down to this. Can I sell it as something different? So I actually think that the commercial impulse, if you like, was key to Wallace developing what we might call a biogeographic sensibility, namely combining his biology and his surveying, his geography. So off he goes to the next destination. Now, he's not really mapping here. This is the delights of the Malay Archipelago. Extraordinary journeys. We've had a number of people have touched upon them. One thing I just want to emphasize, I think this is kind of cool. He actually built one of these himself, or had men build it for him. He had his own prow, have prow will travel, and went on all sorts of slightly disastrous zigzag tours of various places he didn't intend to go, and he missed a few that he intended to go to because the wind was in the wrong direction. But in his autobiography, he's writing about his shortcomings. Only Alfred Russel Wallace could, in his autobiography, have a whole section dedicated to his shortcomings. We all know what an autobiography is for. An autobiography is to brag and to point out that anyone who ever disagreed with you is a moron. Okay, I mean, that's what it's all about. Preening, right? Now, Wallace, he talks about his mental shortcomings in certain areas. But one of them, and I love this, is his almost complete inability to swim. This was partly due to a physical deficiency, which I was unable to overcome. My legs are unusually long for my height, and the bones are unusually large. The result is that they persistently sink in the water, bringing me into a nearly vertical position, and their weight renders it almost impossible to keep my mouth above water. What a disaster! Especially, as I say, he's spending literally months at a time, more or less, in the ocean on these tiny boats. He's remarkable that, courtesy that conflagration, he has comparative experience. He knows the New World wet tropics, Amazonia, and he knows the Old World wet tropics in Southeast Asia. He's got this extraordinary comparative database on board. Now, even better, he can go more local, and he's skipping, say, from Borneo to New Guinea. And he can do the same kind of comparisons. It's all about comparison, and it's all about the onboard natural history database that I talked about earlier this morning. And he says, look, you go to New Guinea and Borneo, and you see how totally the productions of New Guinea, the animals and plants, differ from those of the western islands of the archipelago, say Borneo. There's nothing in common. And yet, and this is a curious thing, there are clear similarities of their climate and physical features. Now, what does that mean? The prevailing idea, remember, is divine design. God looks at an environment and says, what's the best way to design an organism to put in that? Okay? Well, it's a wet, tropical, primary forest. These are the organisms I'm going to put there. So everywhere under that model, where you have wet primary forest, you should have the same organisms, right? Because they're equally well adapted to them. Okay? That's not what you see. You've got two places which are ostensibly the same in terms of climate and physical geography, very different organisms. Why is that? Then you've got two places which are extremely similar biologically. New Guinea and mainland Australia. Mainland Australia is a bloody desert with the occasional, punctuated by the occasional kangaroo, right? Extremely different. And yet you've got all these similarities between what's in New Guinea, very different from what's in Australia. So, how can we account for that? History, ladies and gentlemen, history. So what it is, it's not just design and adaptation. What it is the evolutionary process is quirky. Why do you have so many kangaroos in Australia? Because the first kangaroo appeared in Australia, and it's a genealogical process that is giving rise to descendant species. So this view matured into something which Wallace is closely associated with, the so-called biogeographic realms. So here's the near tropics, so basically South America. Then we've got the Nearctic, that's North America, and so on. These are fundamental divisions of the world according to the organisms that live there. And this is actually kind of interesting. This is the map actually from Wallace's 1876, his great Meisterwork on biogeography. There are two areas of shallow water. One is around New Guinea and Australia, and the other is around peninsular Malaysia, running all the way down to Java and Sumatra. Okay? That's a navigational observation. It took Wallace's natural history flair to pick the biogeographic significance of those two different areas. And this is an account from his autobiography. And it's very Wallacey. It's serendipitous. He was trying to get from Singapore to Makassar in Sulawesi. Having been unable to find a vessel from Singapore direct to Makassar, I took passage to Lombok, whence I was assured I should easily reach my destination. By this delay, which seemed to me at the time a misfortune, I was enabled to make some very interesting collections in Bali and Lombok, two islands that I should otherwise never have seen. I was thus enabled to determine the exact boundary between two of the primary zoological regions, the Oriental and Australian. This is remarkable because those two islands, they're about, at their closest, about 20 miles apart. They're sitting next door to each other. Wallace, the great meticulous recorder and observer, notices that Bali is sort of Asian in the birds he's looking at, goes across to Lombok, and now he's looking at Australasian birds and mammals. Okay? Acute natural history, and the product, as you know, is what is called Wallace's Line. And again, I emphasize that this is after the fact. It was Huxley actually who dubbed it Wallace's Line. Now, it's a whole complex region, usually called Wallacea, by the way, in here. What you have is two big blocks of shallow water land, Sunda and Sahul. This is New Guinea and Australia. And then you've got this sort of confusion within. The cool thing is, and Richard actually alluded to this already, Wallace didn't have a good understanding of the process underpinning this. He just had the empirical observation. What we now know is you've got two plates which have come together very slowly. So the proximity of Bali and Lombok is a recent, well, by geological standards, innovation. And just to make the point, here's a nice animation showing going back in time, and these are ice ages, which are tying up a whole load of seawater, having a huge impact. Look, this is all one block of land now. This is all one block of land. So these are really shallow seas that you take a bit of water out of the system with an ice age, and suddenly those lands are no longer islands, so to speak. They're no longer isolated from each other. So look, that was the big biological, biogeographic, biology meets surveying observation. But there was all sorts of other things which depended upon this. Wallace publishes a paper in 1865. It's his most beautiful paper. It's on the butterflies, a group of butterflies in Southeast Asia. And in it, he produces a definition of what a species is. Again, Jim talked about this morning. A species is a problematic term. It's a very difficult thing to define. But this is a beautiful, brilliant, and prescient definition. Species are merely those strongly marked races or local forms which, when in contact, do not intermix, and when inhabiting distinct areas are generally believed to have separate origins and to be incapable of producing fertile offspring. Now, that, by the way, is generally attributed to well-known 20th century biologists like Ernst Mayr. Okay? No, it's typical Wallace. He thought of it first, and we've all forgotten the fact that he thought of it. And he even goes further, and this is really cool. He says, it's all very well saying these two species are because they can't interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. You can't actually do that when you've got two things in your hand, right? You can't say, well, will you mate? Will you have... No, you've got to make more immediate calls. So we've got, this is the geography of engagement, if you like, with the local people. And because he's empathetic, because he's open-minded, and this actually starts when he's in the Amazon, he's writing in 1851, he's incredibly impressed. This is not, by the way, a noble savage idea. This is more a condemnation of his own industrialized society. Must millions suffer these dread miseries while but a few enjoy the grateful fruits? That's capitalism, folks. For are there not, confined in our dense towns and scattered over our most fertile fields, millions of men who live a lower life, lower in physical and moral health than the red Indian of those trackless wilds? That was early. This is clearly a preoccupation, because he finishes his great work, the Malay Archipelago, with a more nuanced version of the same statement. This really got up the nose of his Victorian reviewers, okay? It's very remarkable that among people in a very low stage of civilization, we find some approach to such a perfect social state. I've lived with savages in South America and the East who have no laws or law courts, but the public opinion of the village freely expressed. Each man scrupulously respects the rights of his fellow, and any infraction of those rights rarely or never takes place. In such a community, all are nearly equal. This is an egalitarian paradise. Compare that with the wealth and knowledge and culture of the few, that's the learned few, and then the great unwashed masses. That does not constitute civilization, and do not of themselves advance us towards the perfect social state. Our vast manufacturing system, our gigantic commerce, our crowded towns and cities support and continually renew a mass of human misery and crime absolutely greater than has existed before. It's a stinging rejoinder, and one, incidentally, that was picked up by a very famous man. J.S. Mill, the great utilitarian philosopher and economist, was really taken with this section of Wallace's book, and this is from Wallace's account in My Life, procured me the acquaintance of John Stuart Mill. On reading the concluding pages in which I condemn our civilization as but a form of barbarism, and refer, among other examples, to our permitting private property and land, he wrote and recruited Wallace to something he was interested in, Land Tenure Reform Association. Okay, so an interesting interaction there. Private property in land. He's been in Nyack Longhouses. This is a single house, 5 times the length of this stage, in which the entire village lives. There's no private ownership of property. There's no private ownership of land. Everything is essentially collaborative and cooperative. This, for Wallace, was a paradise. So where is he going to condemn British society? What's the root of the disparities, the misery that he sees in Britain? He's a geographer. He's a surveyor. It comes down to the land. So Wallace, building on his experiences through Mill, would in a decade become the founding president of a new socialist organization. But it's so wonderfully Wallacey. Yes, it's all about egalitarianism. It has this utopian dream of ridding the world of these miserable Victorian slums. How do we do it? This is the Wallace solution. This is geography meets social problems, the land nationalization society. I hope I've convinced you that we have this rather wonderful thread through a lot of Wallace's thinking, both scientific and social, which is rooted in an appreciation of matters geographical. And that early surveying education was something that he put to good use for many years to come. Thank you very much.